technical, but I'm going to try not to and give you a little bit of an overview, and I'll leave it to the speakers that come after me to do more of the technical stuff. What I want to talk about is, and this sounds like the title of a Harry Potter book more than a presentation about PDF. I'll try to keep it as interesting as that as well. What I'm going to talk about is PDF and then all of the standards that are built around that. On the one hand, standards in the graphic arts industry, PDFX, most notably, of course. But then also a little bit about all of the standards that work around the graphic arts focus area. What you'll see in the presentations after this is people going into more of the details of some of these standards. But I think it's good to have a little bit of an overview first before we do that. And to do that, it's important that we go back in history a little bit. And we're actually going to go back to 1993 and the company that caused all of the problems that we're talking about today, which is Adobe. In a relatively small company at the time, that's not necessarily the case today. In 93, they came out with a new file format called PDF, Portable Document Format. And that was very interesting and something that the graphic arts industry started looking at relatively quickly, not with version 1.0 because that missed a number of important features, but starting from version 1.2 and certainly 1.3, it became a very interesting file format for graphic arts in general. And you probably know most of the reasons for that, but just to recap that a little bit, it's a very compact format. It allows you to store a lot of information in a relatively small package. It also allows random access, and that is probably what differentiated it most from things like PostScript. If I have a 1,000-page PDF file, I can get to page 999 very quickly without having to look at all of the other pages that come before it. It describes appearance, which is very important. It is not a format like HTML that talks about structure of documents and where it's up to anyone who renders it to figure out what that means. I mean, if you look at how much time is spent today to make sure that websites look the same on different platforms and in different browsers, you understand why that is an important thing. The portable document format was designed to be appearance-driven. It was designed to tell you where images were, where text was, where line art was. Not so much the structure, but how a document looks. And starting with version 1.3, it had all of the features that you kind of needed in a graphic arts workflow in terms of color spaces and support for fonts and support for images and compression and all of those things. Now, unfortunately, as Adobe initially didn't conceive this format for graphic arts, they also put a lot of features in there that weren't necessarily helpful in the graphic arts workflow. And in fact, it's not even a matter of not being helpful, it's a matter of not knowing what to do with that stuff. If you have a PDF file that contains a sound fragment or a movie, there is no way to print that on a printing device. So there is a lot of stuff you can do in PDF that really doesn't have any application in graphic arts. And at the same time, and that's linked to the first point, at the same time it's not really strict enough, meaning that you can do a lot in PDF. I can put color in there, and that color can be CMYK, which you probably like in most workflows, even today, but it can also be RGB and calibrated RGB and whatever you want. And not all of these things were that well to have in a PDF file that was going to be sent to a printer. So what was needed on top of that, on top of the actual PDF format, was more rules to standardize what happens to that document. You needed to have a way, or you needed to specify which color spaces could be used. You needed to be able to make sure that all of the fonts were in there, that there were no movies, no sounds, none of these multimedia features in there. There had to be a trim box in it, you wanted output intent, you wanted the file to to identify itself as something that was meant for a graphic arts workflow. And because of the need of all of those restrictions, what happened is that a standard was built called PDFX to put these restrictions in place and to once and for all define a version, a flavor of PDF, if you want, that was designed for graphic arts and could be used in graphic arts. The X in PDFX comes from blind exchange, which has always been a little bit of a mystery to me. But the point is, what you want to have as a situation is that a designer can create documents and can basically throw them over the wall to a printer, and the printer can print them. And the two don't necessarily have to talk to each other. If the designer creates a PDFX file, the idea was that the file would be good enough that the printer could just take it and print it, and they would get the correct result. That's the theory. In practice, that works up to a point. The fact that you have a PDFX file is better than when you have a PDF file. And you can see it in a way that PDF is the general standard meant for everybody. If you look at PDFX, then it puts some restrictions in place. It actually makes the format smaller if you want. And that is better. In terms of reliability, you end up with something that is much better than a generic PDF file. Unfortunately, even in PDFX, there is still a lot of freedom in what you can do, what you can put in that file, and how you can define it, and so on. And if you want to use a PDF file for specific uses, say you want to make an advertisement that is going to be in a newspaper or in a magazine, you need more rules than what is available in PDF and PDFX. And what happened, and what the workgroup did, was build on top of that PDFX layer. So PDF for everybody, you restrict that by putting in limitations, and you end up with PDFX that is specific for graphic arts. And then what the workgroup did was build PDFX plus specifications that really limit the usage of a PDF file for a specific focus area, such as magazine ads or newspaper ads or commercial print and so on. Good. In case you thought it was simple, this is a true slide. It also contains, well, the purple isn't very visible, but what you have here is on the left-hand side, you have all the different versions of PDF itself. Going, I dropped the first two, but going from PDF 1.2, and then we're back in '96 already, so that's going back far enough, I think, and up to PDF 1.7. And then on the right-hand side, you have all of the different. That's much better, thank you. All of the different PDFX formats that are built on PDF. And there are, out of this very confusing slide, there are two sets of numbers that are important to remember. The first one is, on the left-hand side, PDF 1.3, and on the right-hand side, PDFX 1A. That is important because all of the work that the Ghent workgroup and most of us today in graphic arts do is based on those numbers. We all worked with specifications that are built on top of PDFX 1A, and PDFX 1A uses PDF 1.3. So basically we're all using a standard, a PDF standard that was conceived in 1999. That's 12 years ago. And it works pretty well. It misses some modern features though. PDF 1.3 doesn't allow transparency, it doesn't allow, or PDFX 1A that is built on there doesn't allow color management features, it doesn't allow the use of layers, so there are some pretty serious restrictions in those standards as well. And the second set of numbers that is important removes those restrictions. You have PDFX4, which is the base of the specifications that the Ghent workgroup is working on today. And as you can see, PDFX4 is based on PDF 1.6, and that allows those new features. And that is also the reason why we're working on these new specifications and why those new specifications are built on PDFX4, because it allows those more modern features. And I'm not going to go in more detail on this because I know that Peter is going to talk about the details of PDFX4 and what the new specifications bring in much more detail. So that's part of the standardization that happened in around PDFX and in graphic arts. It's the move from PDF to PDFX, and then what the Gantt group does with PDFX+. At the same time, the file format that was underneath all of those standards was still owned by Adobe. PDF 1.7 was still a file format that was written by Adobe and where the intellectual property right was owned by Adobe. And what happened in the meantime is that that file format was standardized as well. Adobe went to the ISO and basically gave them the file format to be maintained by the ISO going forward. And what they're working on then is the next version of PDF, where you'll have new features. But this time, instead of Adobe sitting in their corner and doing the work, it is actually the ISO organization that has a subcommittee looking at that new file format and developing the new version. So not only is PDFX an ISO standard, but the underlying file format PDF is an ISO standard as well in the meantime. Okay, so talked about PDFX, but everything I said up to now is important in graphic arts and is limited to graphic arts if you want. PDFX is a very graphic arts oriented file format. In the meantime, a number of other standards have appeared outside of that graphic arts market, or partially outside of that market, and some of those are important to know about even if you're mainly focused on graphic arts as well. There is a whole list of standards that was developed outside the PDFX world. I think it's important to understand that these formats exist, what they cover, not necessarily all the details, but it's important to know what they are and that they are there, so that if you run into a situation where you need them, you know that they are available. And again, I'm not going to go into all of the details on these, because that is probably enough material to talk 2 days about, but let me summarize a little bit what these standards are for. Beginning with PDF VT. VT is the one that probably comes closest to what we do in graphic arts. The V stands for variable data, the T comes from transactional printing. So basically that's all the paper you get in your letterbox every morning that says, dear so-and-so, you've won 2 million euros. Or the bill you get that has your name printed on it and an amount you have to pay. That's variable data on the one hand, transactional printing, or an example of that on the other hand. PDF VT is built on PDFX4, so it allows all of the features that you have in PDFX4, a very rich graphics model, and all of the other nice stuff that you have in there. It also has a number of functionalities and features that are specific to that kind of high volume workflow that you have in variable data and in transactional printing. There are file formats that are used today in there, PPML, AFP, and PDFVT basically wants to be a modern replacement, standard replacement for those file formats. Is this important for you? Well, if you are in an environment where you do that kind of work, yes. If not, you'll probably not really run into it. Next one up is outside of graphic arts, if you want, although I'm sure there is some overlap here and there. PDFA, the A comes from archival, is a standard that is geared at long-term archival of documents. And long-term can mean very different things to different people. It goes from financial documents that you have to keep for 7 years or 11 years, depending on the country, to people that want to keep documents around to 50 years, which is what the standard officially talks about, to libraries that say we want to digitize the material that we have and we want to keep it forever. And the standard tries to make a PDF file that is constructed in such a way and quality controlled in such a way that 50 years from now we will still be able to open it, it will still look the same, and in many cases we will still understand it the same as we do today. PDFA is important, but the way in which it is used, the volume that is used today differs very much from country to country. And we don't change this slide for every country where we give this presentation. It happens to be very strong in Italy. It's a fact. And the reason that it's strong in Italy is because there is legislation, there are laws in place that tell certain people that they have to supply PDF-A files, and that is typically how these things progress. If you look at the Netherlands, for example, PDF-A is actually making some inroads there as well, and the reason is exactly the same. There are laws in place now that force certain groups of people to supply certain types of documents as PDF-A files. Is this important as a standard for you? Yes and no. It is, of course, not geared at the graphic arts market per se, but it is very similar to PDFX, and at the same time, there are many cases where documents have to be printed, but at the same time also have to be archived for a while. And then the fact that PDF-A exists is important to realize. PDF-E, I can be very, very brief about that. PDF-E was geared at engineering. It allows some very engineering-oriented functionality like 3D models to be incorporated in a PDF file. In reality, it hasn't really taken off all that much. It's also pretty close to where regular PDF files are anyway. But there is a variant of that called EA that is much more interesting, because that's a mix of what happens in the archival space and what happens in the engineering space. So a PDF EA document allows you to put these 3D models in and all of those nice features for engineering, but at the same time it draws from the strength of PDF-A and makes them archivable for a long period of time. And in that market, that's very important. If you build a bridge and that bridge is going to be there for 50 years, you'd prefer that the manual is still there and that the drawings are still there in 50 years as well, and that they look the same as what you've built, basically. It's not unimportant. And then the last one here is an important one as well. It is not completely there yet in terms of adoption, but again, it's one of those standards that will become much more important by the use of laws and legislation. PDF UA, where the UA stands for Universal Accessibility, is a standard that aims at taking PDF and at making sure that that PDF is accessible, and that requires a number of things. It requires that the structure of the PDF is known as well, because if you want to do something like be able to read part of a PDF by a screen reading device, then you need to know what a paragraph is in that particular PDF file. And you need to know that if there is a picture in there, that you have some semantic context for that picture, that you know it's the Eiffel Tower, for example, because then again you can get help other than just looking at the picture. So you have all of these standards, and I think 3 of those are, relatively speaking, less important, at least for what we're doing here. The other 3, PDF-A, PDF UA, and PDFX, at least you should keep an eye on. And also what you see in terms of the further development of those standards is that if you look at what people are thinking of for the next versions of PDF, not the 2.0 version, last I heard that was going to come out somewhere next year, so that's too close in if you want to do very spectacular things. But if you think further down the line, what you see happen is that these different PDFs-based standards, like PDF-A and PDFX and PDF UA, that they grow closer together. And what you can envision is that a future version of PDF would incorporate many of the things that we've learned while making all of these individual standards. And